Hi, Santosh here again. Section 15 of Transfer of Property Act is what we will study today. We'll try to understand. This is basically a revision of the previous sections, that is 13 and 14. Plus, additionally, there is something which we need to understand in this act. Let's see what it is. Okay. Very briefly, just go through it. We're going to come back to this section in detail. It says transfer to class, some of whom come under section 13 and 14. Very clearly mentioned that 13 and 14 are to be referred when we're going to understand this section. Okay, so very briefly, let's understand what is section 13. It's basically dealing with an unborn child. Wherein in section 5, we deal with the two living people, and transfer of property can happen between two living people. But here, it comes as an exception. So very briefly, let's try to understand with an example. Like property of A, he wants to transfer it to an unborn child D. Now he has to create a life interest in someone else because the child D is still not born. So what he does is he creates a life interest in B, who shall transfer this property on D being born and attaining the age of 18. That is his majority. Now, there is something which we need to understand. Unless it creates absolute interest, that means the transfer creates an absolute interest in the unborn child. So this is very briefly what we are trying to understand with section 13. Let's go to section 14 again very briefly, because these two sections are referred in section 15. That's why we are studying them briefly, so that you don't have to go back again and see the videos or refer the sections. So let's see. Let's take an example. A wants to transfer property to an unborn child. Since the child is not born, the property cannot be transferred to an unborn child. It becomes something like transferring to a person who is still not existing. So it is something what we mention abeyance of ownership. That means there's nobody who exists and you want to transfer them. That is not possible. So if at all they want to transfer, then he has to transfer it to B or create a life interest in B, and after the child is born and attains age of 18, he has to transfer. Now, what is the difference between this section and the 13th section? So here, the perpetuity is being spoken about. That means the C, unborn child, is being transferred the property on his attaining of 18 years. If the property is to be transferred on his attaining of 25 years, then it becomes void, because perpetuity stops, the rule against perpetuity stops the property being transferred to beyond this limit. That is the life interest of B, plus when the unborn child is born, he attains his maturity or majority, that is 18 years. So that is rule against perpetuity. So there's one more important point what we should also remember, that is, if you look at this highlighted line which says existence at the expiration of that period, that means very clearly it is mentioned that C should be born before the death of such person in whom this life interest is created. That's it. So let's go to section 15, which speaks of a new word That is the class. What is this class? So we'll understand what is this class. And other watchwords are interest fails, and that is the reason which shall be contained in 13 and 14. So let's understand class before we again understand this section in detail. So what is a class? A class, very crudely, we understand that we have a first class or second class in a school, maybe first grade or second grade, what we call. So we have something like that. So for LLB, say first year of LLB or second year of LLB is a class. So here what we are referring is a class of sons. That means son forms or sons form a class. Let's assume, or let's try to superimpose a class of first year LLB as sons. That means even if there's a single student, then even then it still forms the class of first year. The same way, if there is a single child who is a male, then it forms, or he falls in the class of sons. The same way we have other classes like daughters. Daughter class can be made, or it can be mentioned. We also understand that these two can form a bigger class, that is all children. That means sons and daughters could form the class of all children. So we also can have married children as a class. When we talk of married children, we have unmarried children as another class. So this is how the class is to be mentioned by the person who is transferring the property. Yes, so let's understand the section 15 with an illustration. Say that A wants to transfer his property to the unborn children. For this particular illustration, let's take a single daughter and sons. We can change this equation of sons, daughters later on. We'll try to understand that also. So, since the daughter and sons, or daughters and sons, are not born, it falls under abeyance of ownership. That means they cannot get, or the ownership cannot be transferred directly to them since they don't exist. What happens is there is a life interest or a prior interest created in B, who shall transfer this property to these children when they're born. Now the deed comes with a rider, or you can say a condition, that property to have life interest for daughter. What happens with this condition? This condition makes the absolute, in fact the sons would get the absolute interest. But what happens? This life interest which is given to daughter shall be denied under section 13 and 14, which says rule against perpetuity. You cannot transfer the property beyond a life interest, that is the first generation and the unborn child's attainment of 18 years, not beyond that. But in this case, what happens? The daughter's life extends beyond the children being born and then 18 years on their attainment of majority. So this section specifically says that it denies, in fact, the daughter's right. Daughter's right doesn't, and at the same time, daughter's right doesn't block son's absolute interest, but her interest becomes void. So her interest is denied under section 13 and 14, but the sons get absolute interest. That is the crux of this section 15. That means the class of sons would get this property divided among themselves minus the daughter, because the daughter has been devoid of this property under section 13 and 14. So now let's come back to the section so that we understand it with what we have studied or understood with respect to the class, the interest fails. In fact, the class, I think we have understood what is a class. The class could be of a son's class, daughter's class, married, unmarried. Here it was the son's class which will not be affected because of the interest which fails or by reason of the rules contained in section 13, 14, which shall be applied on the daughter. So the whole class, or the class which is not being affected by this section or rule of 13 and 14 shall get the interest, or in fact absolute interest, and the other shall fail because of the section 13 and 14. That is the importance of this section, which is kind of a revision, or maybe it encompasses the meaning of 13 and 14. So case law, which talks about the same thing what we discussed in the illustration. Raja Bajrang Bahadur Singh versus Thakuran Bhagat Raj Kaur. Supreme Court held that, there was an amendment in 1929, after which such rule against perpetuity shall stop people to create interest beyond the certain limit which is mentioned in section 14. So hope we have understood very briefly section 13, 14, and in detail section 15. So thank you very much, and yes, if you like this video, please like it and also subscribe. Thank you.